They thought it was just an old man living alone on a quiet New Mexico ranch, until a convoy of cartel trucks rolled over his land. Armed men, weapons blazing, expected easy victory, but they hadn't counted on Daniel Reyes, a retired Green Beret, a man whose silence hid decades of lethal skill. He turned his home into a fortress. Traps, precision strikes, and decades of combat experience met arrogance and bullets head-on. And when his niece Sofia faced her first real threat, everything changed. This is not just a story of survival. It's a lesson in discipline, courage, and a quiet wrath that no enemy could escape. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The land stretched wide and dry beneath the morning sun, the kind of silence only desert country could hold. Daniel Reyes stepped out of his weathered ranch house with a mug of black coffee in one hand and the steady gait of someone who had long since adjusted to solitude. At 58, his shoulders still carried the posture of a soldier, though his knees ached from years of rucking across unforgiving terrain. His ranch was small, a patch of earth fenced against dust storms and stray cattle, but it was enough. Out here, the world demanded quiet strength, and Daniel gave without hesitation. The corral posts leaned under their own weight, needing repair. The roof on the barn sagged in places where storms had battered it. Nothing about the ranch looked impressive to anyone passing by. But to Daniel, every imperfection carried the mark of his work. He ran his palm over the splintered wood of the gate, checking the hinges, just as he had once run checks on gear before night operations. Routine meant survival. Out here, routine meant the ranch kept standing one more day. He moved to the chicken coop, scattering feed in practice handfuls. The hens clucked and shuffled around his boots, and the sound filled the morning air with a rhythm that reassured him more than words ever could. Daniel spoke little these days. Silence was a companion, and silence did not demand explanations. The scars on his forearms, faint lines that crossed like maps, said enough about a life that had required sacrifice. Some scars were deeper, the kind no one saw, carrying away his gaze when he looked toward the horizon. His days began before dawn, the way they had in the army, when sleeping past the sun meant falling behind. Even in retirement, his body woke as if reveille still sounded. He built his mornings around discipline. Coffee, livestock, the land. He sharpened tools in the barn with the same attention he once gave to blades and weapons. Old habits didn't die. They simply shifted. A shovel honed well could serve as faithfully as a bayonet. By mid-morning, Daniel rode the perimeter of his property on an old bay horse named Valor. The name wasn't sentimental, it was practical. The horse had carried him through flash floods and across rocky arroyos with steadiness no truck could manage. He trusted Valor the way he had trusted his unit in the field, without question, without hesitation. Tracks in the dust caught his eye. Coyotes, most likely, though his instincts pressed him to notice details. Weight, distribution, depth, direction. He bent low, fingers brushing the edge of one print, and his mind cataloged possibilities. Not everything that crossed his land was wild. Back at the ranch house, he set tools in neat lines on the workbench. Wrenches, hammers, spare wire, each placed with the precision of a soldier laying out equipment before a mission. Disorder was unacceptable. In the stillness of the desert, order was the only defense against chaos. When the sun began to lean westward, Daniel sat again on the porch. The land stretched out before him in shades of brown and gold, broken only by the occasional juniper. It was not a grand ranch, not a place built for wealth. It was a place for breathing, for remembering, and for forgetting when forgetting became necessary. Inside, in the back of the house, a trunk remained locked. Few ever saw it. Inside were service medals dulled with time, uniforms folded with care, and photographs of men who had not all returned. Daniel never opened it without reason. The trunk was a reminder of where he had been, of why he could never fully step out of the life he had left. The ranch might have seemed like retirement, but it was also a perimeter, a post he still guarded. As evening settled, he lit a lantern in the barn and wrote a brief note in a ledger he kept by the stall. Weather conditions, livestock count, maintenance needs, simple records that anyone else might overlook. To him, it was intelligence gathering, a habit formed long before New Mexico mornings replaced foreign deserts. He noted the tire marks again, faint but present, near the north fence line. Nothing urgent. Not yet. But his hand paused on the page longer than usual before he closed the book. When darkness came, Daniel sat alone with a plate of beans and tortillas. The desert night hummed with insects, the occasional bark of a coyote in the distance. He ate in silence, his mind as steady as his hands. A man like him didn't seek trouble, but he knew better than most that trouble did not care what a man sought. The ranch was quiet for now, but quiet was only ever conditioned before something else arrived. He leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the stars as if waiting for orders that would never come, and let the silence close around him like a familiar cloak. The town nearest Daniel's ranch was little more than a crossroads where the feed store shared a block with the post office, a diner with fading paint, and a hardware shop that smelled of dust and oil. It was the sort of place where news traveled faster than mail, carried on the lips of men leaning against trucks and women waiting in line for groceries. Lately, the talk had shifted from cattle prices and rainfall to something darker. Strangers had been spotted south of the border, convoys at night, and a sudden increase in thefts from isolated farms. The whispers always ended the same way: cartel activity pushing north, looking for new routes, new land, and new ways to spread their reach. Daniel heard the talk each time he came into town for supplies, but he never lingered on it, while the others filled the diner booths with their worry. He sat alone at the counter with his coffee, nodding politely but offering little. People expected stories, speculation, a volley of fears. Daniel gave them none. His life had taught him that worry was wasted energy. Action mattered, preparation mattered, and silence often carried more weight than a dozen opinions. The ranch demanded his attention more than rumors ever could. A section of fence on the west side had sagged under the weight of wind and time, and Daniel spent his days driving posts deep into the ground, steadying them with wire, measuring each line with an eye trained to precision. The work was slow, sweat-heavy under the desert sun, but it brought him a kind of peace. Each hammer strike was deliberate, the rhythm of a man who had spent decades moving with intention. The world beyond his boundary lines might shift and grow dangerous, but here he could control the shape of things. Still, the whispers found their way into the quiet of the ranch. A ranch hand from a neighboring spread stopped by one afternoon, leaning on the fence with the ease of someone used to long days in the saddle. He mentioned headlights seen moving across a dry wash at midnight, vehicles with engines too heavy for ranch work. He spoke of family further south who woke to find their cattle gone and their barn door kicked in. His words hung in the hot air like smoke, but Daniel only nodded, thanked him for the warning, and went back to his task. Fear was natural, but fear did not fix fences. At night, Daniel sat on his porch with the lantern dimmed, listening to the land the way he once listened for distant patrols. The desert was never truly silent. Owls called, coyotes barked, insects hummed, but he could sense when something was out of place. His horse would lift its head sharply, ears pricked, when a sound carried wrong on the wind. Daniel took note, storing each detail in the mental ledger he had been keeping his entire life. He never called it vigilance. It was simply how he had been built. In town, men argued about whether the sheriff's office could handle cartel violence if it spilled across the border. Some called for more deputies. Others spoke of militias and community patrols. Daniel kept his counsel. He had fought wars in countries where governments fell in a week and patrols meant little. He understood that danger did not announce itself politely, nor did it wait for committees to make plans. When it came sudden and sharp. For now, his cattle needed tending, water troughs needed filling, and the roof of the old barn demanded patching before the summer storms rolled in. The chores grounded him, each one a reminder that survival was built on small, steady efforts. He worked with the calm of a man who had already seen the worst the world could throw at him. The scars on his hands caught the sun as he coiled wire, and the muscles in his arms moved with the memory of carrying weight far heavier than lumber. When he returned to town again at week's end, the whispers had grown louder. A man claimed he saw armed riders south of the border fence, their silhouettes sharp against the setting sun. Another swore he heard rapid gunfire echo across the desert. The townsfolk exchanged nervous glances, their voices dropping low, as if the very air might carry their words to the wrong ears. Daniel paid for his supplies, loaded them into the back of his truck, and left without joining the circle of fear. On the road back to the ranch, the horizon stretched wide and empty, but Daniel's eyes tracked the ridgelines, the washes, the places a man might hide or watch. He saw what others didn't, but he did not let it show. The land had taught him patience, and his years in uniform had taught him that when trouble comes, it favors those who wait in readiness rather than those who rush to panic. The ranch would hold, the fences would stand, and if danger crossed the border, would find Daniel Reyes already prepared, his silence stronger than any rumor carried on the wind. The bus rumbled into the dusty station just after noon, its brakes sighing as though even the machine was tired of the long desert road. Daniel waited near his old pickup, leaning against the driver's door with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to waiting. He hadn't been to the station in years, but he knew what to look for. When the passenger stepped off, blinking against the heat, his eyes found her immediately. Sofia carried herself with the restless energy of someone who had grown up in cities, her backpack slung over one shoulder, hair tied back in a loose braid. She spotted him and waved, the kind of open gesture he had long since trained out his own movements. "Uncle Daniel," she called, her voice bright against the heavy quiet of the afternoon. She crossed the pavement quickly, her sneakers crunching gravel. Daniel nodded, taking her bag without a word. He wasn't a man of greetings or displays, but she didn't seem to mind. The smile she gave him held no expectation. The ride back to the ranch stretched over miles of empty road, where scrub brush and distant mesas rolled by in silence. Sofia filled the air with talk about her classes, her plans for fall, and the relief she felt at leaving the noise of campus life behind for a while. Daniel listened, hands steady on the wheel, adding a few words here and there. He did not need to say much. She was young, eager to spill her thoughts into the quiet, and he understood that silence could hold more than answers ever could. When the ranch house came into view, her voice faltered for the first time. She pressed her forehead to the window, studying the weather boards, the corral, the windmill creaking lazily in the heat. "It's smaller than I imagined," she admitted softly, "but it feels real." Daniel only nodded. To him, the ranch was not about size or comfort. It was about endurance. Inside, the air smelled faintly of leather and dust. Sofia set her bag in the spare room, where sunlight spilled through thin curtains and painted stripes across the wooden floor. She ran her fingers along the dresser's surface, tracing lines cut by time, and smiled as though she had discovered a secret. "It's perfect," she said, though most would have seen only the age and roughness. Daniel watched her reaction carefully. She wasn't here to complain. That alone told him something about her character. The days that followed settled into a rhythm she found comforting. She woke to the sound of roosters and the steady clank of her uncle working outside. She learned how to carry buckets of water, how to mend fence lines, how to coax skittish animals into corrals. Each task left her hands blistered and her shoulders sore, but she laughed at her mistakes and asked questions with genuine curiosity. The ranch became her classroom, though she had no idea the lessons it held went deeper than livestock and weather. To Sofia, the ranch was a place of escape, a retreat from deadlines and lectures, from crowded dorm halls and endless noise. She saw freedom in the wide horizons and peace in the stillness of the nights. What she did not see, could not yet imagine, was a shadow of danger that stretched just beyond those horizons. The worn paths Daniel walked each morning were not only for tending animals. They were patrols, quiet inspections of land he never trusted to remain untouched. The tools he sharpened in the barn were more than farm implements. They were stand-ins for instincts that had never dulled. Sofia laughed at the coyotes that howled at night, thinking them harmless background to her new adventure. Daniel listened with a soldier's ear, measuring distance and direction. She marveled at the clear stars overhead, not noticing how he always sat with his back to the wall, his gaze cutting across the darkness for movements she couldn't see. To her, the ranch was refuge. To him, it was a position to be held. In the evenings, they ate simple meals at the kitchen table, beans, tortillas, grilled meat when the cattle herd allowed. She asked about his past, about his time overseas, about medals she had only glimpsed once in a family photo. Daniel deflected gently, never unkind, but with the weight of a man who knew some stories served no one by being told. She respected his silence and filled the gaps with her own chatter, grateful simply to be in his company. The summer stretched ahead of her like a promise. Sofia believed she had come to the ranch to rest, to clear her head and find a slower rhythm of life. She unpacked her books, set up a small desk by the window, and told herself she would use the quiet to write, to think, to breathe. She never questioned why her uncle watched the horizon so carefully, why his eyes seemed to count every vehicle on the distant highway. To her, danger was far away, just a story carried in the news or whispered by others. She did not yet understand that trouble does not send invitations, and that her peaceful escape was perched on ground her uncle had been guarding long before she arrived. The sun had only begun its climb when Daniel set out with a coil of wire slung over one shoulder and a post-hole digger balanced in his grip. Morning was the only time the desert offered any measure of relief, the air still cool enough to work without the weight of heat pressing against every breath. He moved along the north fence line, where the boards had bowed under pressure from restless cattle. Each step was measured, his boots sinking into the loose sand that clung to the edges of the property, like an uninvited guest. It was there, near the dry wash that cut across the boundary, that his gaze fell on something that did not belong. At first glance, the ground seemed like any other stretch of dust and stone, but years of training had taught him that the earth remembers everything. It keeps the story of what is past, if only a man knows how to read it. 2 sets of tire tracks crossed an angle, deeper than the usual marks left by ranch trucks. The impressions were fresh, cut sharp into the soil, and too close to his fence line to be dismissed as casual passage. Daniel crouched, resting one hand against his knee, and studied the shape of the treads. They were wide, aggressive, built for grip, not the kind a rancher would waste on simple chores, but the kind used by people who expected to push across uneven ground at speed. He followed them with his eyes, tracing where they veered away toward the mesquite. The wind had not yet softened the edges, which meant the vehicles had been here recently, likely under cover of darkness. He said nothing when Sofia joined him later, her steps light as she carried a bucket of feed toward the chicken coop. She called out a greeting, her voice cheerful, but he only nodded, rising slowly and brushing dust from his palms. To her, the morning was just another day, the ranch a canvas for peace. To him, the ground beneath their feet spoke of visitors who had no reason to be there. The work continued as though nothing had changed. Daniel dug new post holes, tamped the soil, stretched wire across the gaps. His movements remained steady, unhurried, but his mind cataloged details as efficiently as any field report he had once written. 2 vehicles, maybe 3. Heavy loads, judging by the depth. Direction of travel, east to west, skirting the boundary but not crossing. A test, perhaps, or reconnaissance. Later, as he rode Valor along the southern pasture, his eyes swept the horizon more often than usual. Each glint of metal in the distance made him pause. A rancher might look for rain clouds or stray cattle. Daniel looked for patterns, for movement where none should be. He carried no rifle across the saddle, only a coiled rope and a water canteen. But he knew better than anyone that appearances did not measure preparedness. At supper, Sofia chatted about a book she had started, describing the way the author painted landscapes with words. Daniel listened, chewing slowly, his silence mistaken for disinterest. She never noticed how his gaze shifted toward the window when headlights flickered faintly on the far road. He did not correct her, did not let his thoughts intrude on her sense of safety. What good would it do to tell her that the desert had grown restless? That night, after she'd gone to bed, Daniel stepped outside and lit a cigarette, the smoke curling into the star-filled sky. The tire marks replayed in his mind at the precision of a map. He knew men who had died because they ignored signs that seemed too small to matter. He also knew the value of patience. Trouble often showed itself first in whispers, in subtle disturbances that only sharpened eyes could see. He ground the cigarette into the dirt and walked the fence line once more, his boots pressing into the same dust where strangers had left their mark. The desert was wide, its silence vast, but Daniel understood it differently from his niece. Silence could be broken at any moment, and when it was, it rarely gave warning. For now, he kept his knowledge to himself the way he always had. He fixed the fences, tended the animals, and let Sofia enjoy the illusion of peace. But the land had spoken to him, and Daniel Reyes did not ignore what the earth remembered. In a dimly lit cantina just south of the border, the air hung thick with cigarette smoke and the sour scent of stale beer. The back room was closed to regular patrons, its door guarded by two men with rifles resting against their knees. Inside, around a scarred wooden table, a group of cartel enforcers leaned over maps and photographs spread beneath the glow of a single hanging bulb. Their voices were low, their tones casual, as though discussing business arrangements rather than the violence that usually followed. At the head of the table sat Esteban Vega, a man in his 40s with sharp cheekbones and a smile that rarely reached his eyes. His tailored shirt marked him as someone who lived above the men he commanded, but the pistol on his hip spoke of how he had risen. He tapped the edge of the map with a finger, tracing a line that cut across the desert northward. "This route is clean," he said. "No checkpoints, no patrols worth mentioning. Quiet land, owned by no one important." His men nodded, their interest more in the money promised than in the details of terrain. A photograph lay at the corner of the table. It showed Daniel's ranch house, captured at a distance by someone who had driven close enough to see, but not close enough to be noticed. The house looked tired, its roof sagging in places, the fences patched. To anyone unfamiliar with the man inside, it appeared the property belonged to an aging rancher with more burdens and strength. One of the younger enforcers laughed as he pointed at the image. "Viejo," he muttered, "an old man. He won't give us trouble. He'll be happy we leave him breathing." The others chuckled, their confidence thick with arrogance. Esteban allowed the laughter, though his eyes remained on the map. He had learned long ago that confidence could blind a man more than fear ever could. Still, his information had come from scouts who swore the land was isolated, the rancher solitary and unremarkable. No family, no neighbors nearby, no lawmen watching. Just a patch of dirt and a crumbling house standing in the way of their new corridor. It was, to them, the perfect choice. One man poured tequila into shot glasses, sliding them across the table. Plans were confirmed between drinks, each toast sealing a step in their design. Trucks would move north under cover of night, using the dirt road that cut past Daniel's property. Weapons would ride with the drivers to discourage interference, though most expected none. The old man's ranch, they agreed, was nothing more than scenery on the way to profit. Outside, the night carried the restless hum of music and engines. The border town pulsed with the energy of men who lived fast and died young, their names carried only in whispers or on graves. The enforcers stepped into the night one by one, their laughter echoing against the narrow streets. They felt no need to worry about a lone rancher tucked away in the desert. Across that desert, under the same stars, Daniel Reyes moved through his barn, checking locks and securing tools. He had no knowledge of the meeting or the men who spoke his name in dismissive tones. But years of experience had already told him something was stirring. The tire tracks, the strange silences, the shift in the air, all small signs that pointed to change. In the cantina, Esteban raised his glass one final time, promising his men that the corridor would bring wealth and power. The map was folded, the photographs gathered, and the decision made. In their minds, the ranch they planned to cross belonged to no one who mattered. What they could not know, what none of their scouts had seen, was that the man inside that weather house had spent decades learning how to hold ground against forces far more organized than theirs. The storm was gathering, though neither side yet understood its shape. For the cartel, it was an opportunity, another stretch of desert to claim. For Daniel, it was still only the weight of silence, a tension he could feel pressing in from the horizon. The plans were set in motion on one side of the border, while on the other, a man sharpened tools and listened to the night, without knowing that soon the desert stillness would be broken. The enforcers laughed, confident in their assumptions, never realizing they had already chosen the wrong ranch to pass through. The crunch of gravel on the long drive reached Daniel before he saw the dust cloud rising. He was in the barn, oiling the hinges of a gate, when the sound made him pause. It wasn't the steady rhythm of Sofia's steps or the clumsy hum of her music drifting from the porch. This was heavier, deliberate, the slow roll of a county vehicle easing its way toward the house. He set the oil aside and wiped his hands on a rag, stepping into the daylight as the sheriff's truck came into view. Sheriff Morales was a broad man in his early 60s, his hair graying at the edges, his uniform clean but worn at the seams. He had known Daniel for years, enough to understand that conversation with him was often one-sided. He parked in the shade of the cottonwood, dust settling around the tires, and climbed out with the weight of someone who carried more than the badge required. His boots crunched the ground as he approached, hat in hand, his eyes scanning the property like a man checking the strength of walls before speaking. "Morning, Daniel," Morales said, his voice calm but edged with purpose. Daniel gave a single nod, his expression unreadable, and motioned toward the porch. They sat across from each other at the wooden table where Sofia often left her books. The air smelled faintly of coffee, though the pot had long gone cold. "There's been talk," Morales began, settling his hat on the table. "More than the usual." He leaned back, studying Daniel, as if measuring how much to say. "Convoys spotted south of the line. Farms broken into. A family out by the river lost half their herd last week. Word is the cartel's moving closer." Daniel listened without interruption, his face still as stone. He picked up a tin of nails from the table, weighing it in his palm before setting it down again. The sheriff watched his movements, waiting for a reaction that never came. "I don't want to spook the town more than it already is," Morales continued, lowering his voice as though the desert itself might carry the words. "But you're out here on your own. No neighbors for miles. If trouble comes this way, it'll hit you first." Daniel finally met his eyes. The silence between them stretched long enough for the sheriff to shift in his chair. When Daniel spoke, it was with the slow steadiness of a man who measured each word. "Appreciate the warning." That was all. No questions, no expressions of worry, just acknowledgement. Morales sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You got that look again. The one that tells me you've already thought about all this twice over." He glanced toward the barn, then the distant fence line. "I won't ask what you've got stashed away out here. Maybe it's better I don't know. But if something happens, I need to hear from you sooner rather than later." Daniel's gaze drifted past the sheriff to the horizon, where heat shimmered against the sand. He gave another nod, not dismissive, but firm enough to close the subject. Morales studied him for a moment longer, as though hoping for more, then stood, as the sheriff walked back to his truck. Sofia appeared in the doorway with a glass of water in her hand, her expression curious. She called out a polite greeting, but Morales only tipped his hat, climbing into the vehicle with a heaviness that did not lift. The engine started, and the truck rumbled back down the drive, leaving behind a faint echo of tires over gravel. Sofia turned to her uncle, eyebrows raised. "What was that about?" she asked. Daniel took the glass from her hand, drank slowly, and handed it back without a word. She waited, but he offered no explanation. Instead, he turned toward the corral, his steps measured, his eyes already scanning the ground the way he always did. The sheriff's warning had not surprised him. He had read it already in the tracks, in the subtle movements of shadows across the land. Trouble was indeed coming this way. But Daniel Reyes had lived long enough to know that words were only reminders. Preparation was something else entirely, and it was something he did not need to explain. The desert at night had its own kind of silence, broken only by sounds that carried farther in the cool air. Daniel sat on the porch with a lantern turned low, its glow casting more shadow than light, and worked the edge of an old combat knife against the whetstone. The steady rasp of steel on stone was rhythmic, almost calming, a sound that belonged to both past and present. His hands moved with memory rather than thought, the motions practiced thousands of times in places where silence had meant survival. Coyotes yipped in the distance, their calls weaving together in a chorus that drifted across the open land. To most, it was a sound of wilderness, nothing more than hungry animals calling to one another. To Daniel, it was a reminder of how noise carried at night, how one sound could reveal position, how the desert never truly hid movement. He paused, lifted his head slightly, and listened. Beyond the coyotes, he picked out faint echoes, a motor far away, perhaps, or something heavier than the wind shifting through the mesquite. The knife caught the lantern light, its blade dull with age but still sharp under his care. It wasn't the weapon he trusted most, but it was the one that held the most history. He had carried it through jungles and mountains, across oceans, tucked against his gear like a quiet promise. The men he had served would have carried their own blades, but Daniel's had outlasted them, not because it was stronger, but because he had kept it close and never allowed neglect. It was more than steel now. It was ritual, a way of steadying his mind in the face of whatever the night might bring. From a window behind him, a faint light glowed where Sofia was reading. He could hear the soft scrape of her chair, the rustle of pages, small comforts that reminded him why he stayed quiet about the tire tracks and the sheriff's warning. She needed the peace she thought she had found here. His job was to make sure she kept it for as long as possible. So he sat with his knife and listened to land, ears tuned to the shifts in sound that others might dismiss. The breeze changed direction, carrying with it the faint smell of exhaust. Daniel stilled his hands. It was too distant to be immediate, but it was there, undeniable. He set the knife down, the whetstone beside it, and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He let his eyes travel to the horizon, where the stars stretched in clear bands across the black. Nothing moved out there, not visibly, but he knew better. Engines left trails even when they were gone. The earth had memory, and so did he. He thought of nights overseas, when patrols had relied on his instincts more than their maps. He had learned to trust that small pull in his chest, the one that told him when something was coming even before it showed itself. That same feeling sat with him now, quiet but certain. Trouble was approaching, the kind that didn't announce itself with words, but with the smallest disturbances a trained man could not ignore. When the coyotes called again, their voices sharper, Daniel stood and gathered his things. He slid the knife back into its sheath and hung it by the door. His movements were unhurried, almost casual, but every step was deliberate. He doused the lantern, letting darkness claim the porch. The stars were enough light for a man who preferred to remain unseen. Inside, Sofia turned another page of her book, unaware of the silence outside sharpening. Daniel stood for a moment, watching through the window, then returned to his chair. He would keep the watch, as he always had, unseen and unacknowledged. Out here, vigilance was not an option. It was the only way a man stayed alive. The night pressed close around the ranch, and Daniel Reyes met it with the patience of someone who had walked into storms before and knew exactly what they felt like before they broke. The sound reached him before the damage did. Daniel had been walking the southern edge of the property just before dawn, his breath clouding faintly in the cool air, when the cattle stirred unnaturally. It wasn't the restless shifting of animals adjusting in their sleep. This was sharper, more frantic, the kind of agitation that carried warning. He stilled, lowering himself beside a mesquite bush, and listened. The faint metallic clatter of wire cut clean gave him the answer he had expected but not yet seen. Someone had touched his fence. He did not move toward the sound. Movement could be read just as easily as tracks, and he had no intention of announcing himself. Instead, he crouched lower, eyes scanning the line of posts until he caught sight of them. Two figures, shadows against the paling horizon, hunched at the boundary. One worked quickly with a pair of cutters, the sharp snip carrying across the silence of the land. The other kept watch, glancing over his shoulder with the nervous ticks of someone not used to patience. Their presence was careless enough to confirm what Daniel had suspected. These were scouts, not seasoned men, testing ground, nothing more. The cattle shifted again, pressing against one another, their unease spreading in waves. A young steer bolted, hooves drumming against the earth as it crashed against the corral, spooking the others into a clumsy stampede that rattled the boards. The intruders laughed low, amused at the chaos they had caused, one gesturing to the other as if to say, "See how easy it is." To them, this was a game, an exercise to mark weakness. Daniel's eyes did not leave them. He noted the tools, the way they carried their weight, the rhythm of their movements. One favored his right leg, slight limp, perhaps an old injury. The other moved lightly but lacked discipline, checking the same direction twice, missing the obvious vantage where Daniel knelt unseen. Their vehicle, an old pickup with tinted windows, sat idling just beyond the fence line. Its headlights remained off, but the hum of the engine betrayed impatience. Minutes stretched. The men cut 3 sections of wire, enough to create an opening wide for a truck, then retreated, satisfied. They had not crossed fully onto the property, had not taken anything, but they left their mark like a signature. The pickup turned slowly, tires spitting dust, and disappeared toward a low ridge that led back south. Silence settled again, broken only by the uneven breathing of the cattle as they calmed. Daniel stood only after the engine's echo faded. He walked to the fence line, boots pressing into the fresh impressions left by the intruders. He knelt, fingers brushing the clean-cut edges of wire still warm from friction. The precision was mechanical, the cutters sharp, new. He straightened, gaze lingering on the horizon where the truck had vanished. He did not curse or shake his head. Instead, he simply absorbed, storing detail after detail in the ledger of his mind. By the time Sofia rose and stepped onto the porch with her coffee, Daniel was already mending the damage. She waved to him, her smile unbothered, unaware that the fence he repaired had been broken hours earlier by hands not their own. He gave a brief nod and continued working, his movements calm and measured. The danger had not crossed fully onto his land yet, and until it did, his role was not to confront but to prepare. Each twist of the wire, each post he reset, was another step in the silent process he had practiced his entire life. He understood what others did not. The first intrusion is never meant to take. It is meant to test. And Daniel Reyes had learned long ago that men who tested would always return, bolder and hungrier. He tightened the final length of wire, set the cutters aside, and looked again to the ridge. His silence was not indifference. It was strategy, sharpened like the knife he kept ready by the door. The barn smelled of hay, oil, and dust, the kind of scent that clung to it long after years of work had passed through its doors. Sofia had gone inside with the simple task of looking for twine. She wanted to bind together some notes and sketches she had made, little records of her summer on the ranch. Things she thought would help her remember this place once she returned to the life waiting for her back at school. Daniel had mentioned a spool kept in an old cabinet near the back wall. She expected to find it easily, but as she rummaged through drawers filled with rusted nails, broken hinges, and bits of leather, her eyes caught on something else. The floorboards beneath the cabinet seemed uneven. At first she thought it was just a barn settling, the way all old buildings eventually did. But as she crouched closer, she saw a faint line, too precise to be natural. She pressed her hand against the edge, and the wood shifted slightly under her weight. A panel, carefully cut and nearly invisible, rested there. Curiosity tugged at her, stronger than the small hesitation that told her she might be intruding. She lifted the panel, slow and cautious, revealing a space hollowed out beneath the boards. Inside lay a trunk, metal corners dull with age but still sturdy. Dust coated the surface, but the padlock was polished, as though handled often. Sofia's pulse quickened. She glanced toward the barn doors, half expecting her uncle to appear and ask what she was doing, but the yard outside was empty. With careful fingers she tugged at the lock, surprised to find it unlatched. The lid opened with a low creak, and inside she saw what her uncle had never spoken of. Weapons filled the trunk. Not just a hunting rifle or an old revolver like she might have expected, but an assortment that spoke of another life entirely. A compact carbine rested across the top, its metal cleaned and oiled. Beneath it lay pistols and leather holsters, a combat knife similar to the one she had seen him sharpening on the porch, and stacks of ammunition arranged with methodical precision. A set of night vision goggles sat wrapped in cloth, their lenses dark and reflective. There were maps, too, folded tightly, marked with grid lines and coordinates that meant nothing to her, but carried the weight of planning and missions. Her breath caught. She had always known her uncle was different, quieter than most, carrying a kind of gravity she couldn't name. But this was proof that his past went far beyond the image of a man tending cattle and fixing fences. She touched the edge of one of the pistols, not daring to lift it, her fingers trembling as though the metal itself carried stories she wasn't ready to hear. Sofia replaced everything exactly as she had found it, closing the lid carefully, lowering the panel back into place. She stood for a long moment in the half-light of the barn, her chest rising and falling too quickly. The sound of boots crunching gravel outside jolted her back to herself. Daniel was moving near the corral, his silhouette calm, steady, unaware that his carefully guarded silence had been breached. She stepped out of the barn a moment later, forcing her expression into one of casual ease. Daniel raised his head slightly, gave her his usual nod, then returned to his work. He didn't notice the way her eyes lingered on him differently now, filled with questions she wasn't ready to ask. That night, lying in the small spare room with the window cracked open to the desert air, Sofia thought about what she had seen. The cache wasn't about hunting or even simple protection. It was preparation, deliberate and disciplined. Her uncle's quiet routines, his constant watchfulness, his refusal to share stories of his past. It all fit together now in ways that unsettled her. She realized that beneath the surface of the peaceful ranch she had come to cherish, another world waited, sharp and dangerous, carried in the hands of the man she trusted most. She turned on her side, pulling the blanket closer, listening to the coyotes call in the distance. For the first time, the sound did not seem harmless. The barn became his workshop long after the sun dipped below the horizon. Daniel worked by lantern light. Sleeves rolled past his elbows, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The ordinary tools of ranch life lay scattered across the workbench. Shovels, axes, hammers, items any farmer might keep within reach. But under his hands, they were transformed. He filed the edge of shovel blade until it gleamed, the scrape of metal against stone sharp in the still air. An axe handle was wrapped with strips of leather for grip, the head polished to a fine edge. What seemed like chores the most were for him. Steps in a process he had carried through jungles and deserts, a process that had kept him alive long before cattle and fences filled his days. He moved with the ease of memory, each action tied to old training that had never truly left him. The sharpening stone sang against steel in a rhythm that felt like prayer. He tested each edge not for appearance but for purpose, weighing them in his hand, striking against wood, listening to the sound as if the tools were speaking back. Out here, far from supply chains and armories, a man's survival depended on turning the simple into the necessary. Daniel understood this better than anyone. When the tools were ready, he stepped outside, lantern extinguished, letting the stars provide all the light he needed. He walked the perimeter slowly, the dry soil crunching beneath his boots, and checked each point of weakness with a soldier's discipline. The tripwires he had once hidden along the northern boundary had grown loose with time. He knelt, his fingers working quickly to reset them, placing small warning measures that would sing to him if someone crossed where they shouldn't. They were crude, improvised from fishing line and scrap metal, but they were enough. He wasn't building traps to kill. He was building ears into the land, signals only he would know how to read. At the fence line, he paused, crouching low to study the dust. The cuts in the wire had been repaired, but he knew the intruders would come again. He sketched their movements in his mind. The approach on the ridge, the cover they chose, the way they tested without crossing. He walked the ground they had walked, retracing steps as though he were following ghosts. Each detail became part of an invisible map he stored in memory, a living document he updated with every patrol. Back at the house, Sofia's light still burned in her window. She believed she was alone with her books, untouched by the danger pressing closer. Daniel allowed her that illusion, even as his own world narrowed into lines of defense and calculations. He sat at the kitchen table with a folded sheet of paper, a pencil in hand, and began to sketch. Not art, not doodles, but maps of the land. Every arroyo, every cluster of mesquite, every stretch of fence marked and measured. He noted sight lines, blind spots, the timing of shadows at different hours of the day. It was a tactical assessment, drawn with the patience of a man who had once briefed others before they went out into the dark. The old habits settled into him like a second skin. Where others saw chores and routines, he saw preparation. Where others saw empty land, he saw terrain to be controlled. As the night stretched on, he sharpened, mapped, rewired, until the ranch was no longer just a patch of desert but a position, a place to hold, to defend. When he finally lay down, he did not sleep deeply. His mind remained alert, ears tuned to the shifting of the wind, the faint calls of coyotes, the silence between sounds. Years of quiet had softened nothing. The soldier inside Daniel Reyes had never left. It had only been waiting. In a roadside cantina lit by neon that flickered more than it shone, the cartel enforcers gathered around tables, sticky, with spilled beer and ash. Music blared from a jukebox in the corner, masking the details of their talk from ordinary patrons. But their laughter carried, careless and loud. A photograph sat in the middle of their table, passed from one set of hands to another. It was the same image their scouts had taken weeks earlier. A weathered ranch house standing lonely against the desert, its roof patched, its fences leaning. To them, it was a picture of weakness, an old man's burden barely holding together. One of the younger men slapped the photo with the back of his hand and grinned. "Viejo," he said, the words stretched in mockery. "This is what stands in our way. A tired rancher too stubborn to sell his land." The table erupted with laughter, the kind that grows louder the less anyone has to prove. Another mimicked the slow gait of an old man, hunching his shoulders and dragging his boots across the dirt floor, earning cheers from his companions. In their minds, Daniel Reyes was already dismissed, a background character in the story of their expansion. Esteban Vega sat at the head of the table, his smile thin, his eyes sharp. He let his men laugh, let them build their confidence, but he said little. He understood the power of arrogance, how it could blind men until the ground beneath them gave way. Still, even he allowed himself a measure of disdain. "He won't resist," Esteban said finally, his tone smooth final. "And if he does, it will make no difference. An old man alone is nothing. The land is already ours." The scouts who had first tested the ranch confirmed the story, boasting about how easily the cattle spooked, how the fence had been cut without resistance. They told it like a game, as if their intrusion had been nothing more than children poking at a wasp's nest. They had not seen Daniel watching from the shadows, had not noticed the precision of his silence. To them, his lack of response was proof of weakness, not strategy. They believed their small test had gone unanswered because there was nothing to answer with. In the weeks that followed, their plans grew bold. Routes were drawn across maps, timetables whispered among drivers and gunmen. The ranch was marked as a waypoint, nothing more, a stretch of land to cross on the way to profit. They stocked trucks with weapons, fuel, and the first shipments ready for the corridor north. And each time the subject of the rancher arose, the men smirked. "Viejo," they repeated, a word that became a joke, a dismissal, a mantra of false confidence. Meanwhile, miles away, Daniel went about his routines without visible change. He patched roofs, tended cattle, mended fences. To any passerby, he looked every bit the part they imagined. A solitary man past his prime, stubbornly clinging to land that offered more work than reward. Yet every swing of his hammer, every circuit of his horse along the ridgelines was measured. He saw the tire tracks multiply, saw the signs of increased passage near his boundary, and marked each detail quietly. His silence was not weakness, but discipline. He had been underestimated before, in places far from the desert, and he had learned the value of letting men believe what they wanted to believe. In the cantina, the laughter went on. Men toasted to their corridor, to the wealth it would bring, never realizing that their joke had already sealed their fate. By calling him nothing, by dismissing him as Viejo, they had ensured they would walk blind into the fences of a man who had spent his life mastering patience, precision, and the art of waiting for arrogance to make its move. Their mistake was not in planning to use his land. Their mistake was in thinking Daniel Reyes was a man who no longer knew how to fight. The night was moonless, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound and made even the desert feel close. Daniel had been walking the perimeter, the quiet rhythm of boots on dust steady beneath him, when he caught the faint gleam of headlights bouncing low against the ridge. They were careful, whoever they were, keeping the beams dim, using the dips in terrain to mask their approach. But Daniel had seen it before, the same dance of engines and shadows, and he knew men who moved like this were not neighbors passing through. He slipped behind a mesquite stand and waited, letting the sound guide him. The truck crept to a stop near the northern fence, engine cutting off with a cough. Two figures stepped out, their voices low, but edged with confidence. Daniel could hear the clink of metal, the dull thud of something heavy being set down in the dirt. He moved closer, keeping the wind at his back, the silence of his steps as practiced as breathing. The men worked quickly, prying up a section of fence and sliding a duffel through the gap. The shape of the bag was too rigid to be clothing, too heavy to be anything but contraband. One man chuckled softly, muttering about how easy it was, how no one cared enough to watch this land. The other agreed, pulling another package from the truck bed. Their voices carried the arrogance of people who thought they were unseen. Daniel was already behind them. He closed the distance with precision, the knife in his hand catching no light as it moved. The first man never heard him. Daniel's arm clamped across his chest, the blade pressed tight against the artery at his neck. He lowered the body silently into the sand, one hand covering the mouth before a sound could escape. By the time the man's companion turned, half distracted by the weight of the second duffel, Daniel was already on him. The strike was clean, fast, a heavy blow to the throat that stole the breath before the mind caught up. The man crumpled, eyes wide, hands clawing at the air, and then stilled. The desert reclaimed its silence. The only sound was a faint rustle of wind against the fence line, the cattle stirring uneasily in the distance. Daniel crouched, checking both bodies with calm efficiency, making certain they would not rise again. He studied their faces, storing the details away. One younger, the other mid-30s, both hardened but not disciplined. Scouts, expendable pieces, on a larger board. He turned to the truck. The keys still hung in the ignition, the doors wide open. Inside were more bags stacked against the seat, the smell of chemical powder strong enough to burn the throat. Daniel pulled one open, confirmed what he already knew, then closed it again. He left the bags where they were, sliding the doors shut with careful hands. The vehicle stayed parked where they had left it, abandoned as if the desert itself had swallowed its drivers. By the time dawn touched the horizon, the only sign of what had happened were two faint depressions in the sand where the men had fallen. Daniel had erased the rest, dragging branches across the tracks, scattering the dust until even a trained eye would see nothing but the shifting ground of the desert. The truck stood silent near the fence, a monument to arrogance, waiting for whoever sent it to wonder why it had not returned. Back at the ranch house, Sofia poured her coffee, stretching sleep from her limbs as if the morning was as ordinary as the day before. She glanced out the window at her uncle crossing the yard, his posture steady, his face unreadable. She saw nothing unusual, nothing that hinted at what had taken place in the night. Daniel offered no explanation. He moved past her with a nod, setting tools in order, feeding animals, fixing boards. To her, it was routine. To him, it was cover. The first clash had come and gone, swift and silent. Daniel did not mark it with pride or anger. He only noted the truth. They had tested again, and this time they had lost more than wire and laughter. Somewhere across the border, questions would be asked, voices would rise, and plans would shift. But here on the ranch, the land remained his, guarded by hands that had not forgotten how to strike when needed. Sheriff Morales arrived mid-morning, his truck raising a plume of dust that hung in the dry air long after the engine shut off. He climbed out with the slow movement of a man who carried both age and responsibility in his bones, his boots scuffing against the packed earth as he made his way toward the porch. Daniel was already there, sitting in the shade with a whetstone and a pair of pliers, working the edge of a tool that looked like it had seen better days. He didn't look surprised to see the sheriff. He rarely did. Morales took off his hat and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. His eyes swept across the property, lingering on the corrals, the barn, and the northern fence line that lay beyond view. "Morning, Daniel," he said, voice measured, the kind of tone men use when circling around a subject before laying it bare. Daniel gave a nod, set the pliers aside, and waited. "There was trouble last night," Morales continued, lowering himself onto the porch step. "Truck found abandoned near the highway. Cargo left behind. No drivers. No bodies." He looked sideways at Daniel, studying the stillness of his face. "Word is, it belonged to some folks who don't like being cross." Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, arms resting on the armrests, his expression unmoved. "Highway is a long way from here," he said. Morales let out a short laugh, though it carried no humor. "You and I both know it's not far enough. Whoever dumped that truck did it close. Closer than I'd like." He rubbed the brim of his hat with his thumb, as though polishing it might help the words come easier. "And I also know you've seen the signs. You've always been the type to notice things the rest of us miss. The silence stretched. Daniel didn't shift, didn't deny, but he didn't confirm either. His eyes stayed on the horizon, where heat shimmered above the land. To a stranger, it might look like indifference. Morales, who had known him long enough, recognized it for what it was: refusal. "I need to ask you straight," Morales pressed. "Did you see anything? Hear anything? Anybody crossing onto your property?" Daniel reached for the whetstone again, running it across the pliers' edge with slow precision. The rasp of metal against stone was his only answer for a long while. Finally, he set it down, his gaze steady. "Nothing I need to report." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "That's not what I asked." "It's what I'm saying," Daniel replied, voice calm, even. Frustration flickered across Morales' face, but he tamped it down. He knew better than to push hard. A man like Daniel wouldn't bend under questions. Not when he had already decided where his line was. Morales sighed, slid his hat back onto his head, and stood. "You're not making this easier on me. You know that? If they come back, and they will, it's going to fall on all of us. The town, the farms, the families. Not just you." Daniel gave another small nod, the kind that ended conversations. His eyes never left the sheriff's, but the weight behind them was clear enough. He would handle what came his way, in his own manner, without interference. Morales lingered at the edge of the porch. He wanted to say more, to press further, but he knew it would be wasted breath. He turned and walked back toward his truck, the dust kicking up around his boots. Before climbing in, he glanced once more at the ranch, at the quiet man sitting like stone in the shade. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, "Stubborn old bastard." As the engine roared to life and the truck rolled back down the road, Daniel remained seated. He picked up the pliers again, the steady rhythm of sharpening resuming, as if nothing had passed between them. Sofia stepped out a moment later, her hair tied back, a book still in her hand. She looked at the departing dust trail, then at her uncle. "What did he want?" she asked. Daniel set the tool aside, rose to his feet, and moved toward the barn without answering. She frowned but didn't press. For her, silence was frustrating. For him, it was protection. He knew the sheriff was right. They would come back. The abandoned truck was only the beginning, a warning disguised as opportunity. Escalation was inevitable, but Daniel Reyes had lived his life preparing for storms. He would not call for backup, and he would not admit what he had done. The less anyone knew, the better. Out here, survival wasn't in confessions. It was in readiness. The morning began the same as any other, with the sun spilling across the desert and the air carrying the dry scent of mesquite. Sofia thought she was heading out to mend fences with her uncle. Another day of work that left her tired but proud. Daniel walked ahead, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder, his steps unhurried yet certain, as if every stone and patch of dust belonged to him. She followed, shading her eyes from the glare, and only realized something different was happening when he stopped near the old corral and placed the rifle in her hands. The weight startled her. She held it awkwardly, fingers unsure, eyes darting toward him for instruction. He said nothing at first, only adjusted her stance with a firm touch on her shoulder, then guided her hands into place. "Feet apart," he finally said, voice low, calm. "Breathe before you squeeze." She nodded, swallowing against the dryness in her throat. The target he had set was nothing more than a battered tin can perched on a post, but it felt like more. She aimed, exhaled, and fired. The kick jolted her, the sound echoing across the empty land. The can didn't move. She cursed softly under her breath, lowering the rifle. Daniel took it back, checked the chamber, and returned it without a word. Again, he adjusted her grip, this time pressing her elbow higher, correcting the way her cheek rested against the stock. "The weapon doesn't do the work," he said. "You do. Respect it or it owns you." The second shot rang out, and this time the can tumbled into the dirt. A smile spread across her face before she could stop it, pride shining in her eyes. Daniel gave a slight nod, the closest thing to praise she was likely to get. They moved on to more cans, then bottles, each one falling as her confidence grew. By the time the sun climbed higher, sweat ran down her temples and her shoulder ached, but she stood taller, steadier, more sure of herself. Later, He led her away from the corral, across open land to a dry wash where the ground was uneven and the brush grew thick. He knelt and drew a line in the sand with a stick. "Find north," he told her. She frowned, pulling out her phone instinctively, but he shook his head. Without that, confused, she scanned the horizon. He waited, silent, patient. Eventually, she remembered what she had once read in a book about the sun's rise and set. She pointed tentatively, and his eyes followed. He gave another small nod. "Learn the land," he said. "It doesn't lie." They spent the afternoon moving silently through the brush. Daniel showed her how to place her feet, so they made less noise, how to use shadows for cover, how to pause and listen for what didn't belong. Each lesson came without lecture, only demonstration, his movements fluid, hers clumsy but improving. When she stumbled, he corrected her. When she grew frustrated, he reminded her with a glance that frustration didn't change outcomes. By dusk, she was exhausted, her body sore from practice, but she carried a sense of accomplishment that no textbook had ever given her. She looked at her uncle, ready to ask why now, why these lessons, but the words died in her throat. His expression was calm, unreadable, yet something in his eyes told her what he would not say aloud. This was not training for her amusement. It was preparation. That night, lying in her bed, the sound of coyotes drifting through the window, Sofia thought about the way he had corrected her aim, the way he had forced her to find her bearings without help. She realized he was giving her more than tasks. He was giving her pieces of himself, pieces of survival that could not be written down. And beneath it all, she understood something else. Daniel was preparing her for a future where he might not be standing beside her. The thought unsettled her, but it also steeled her. If her uncle believed she needed to know these things, then she would learn them well. The message did not arrive with ceremony. It was delivered the way such things often are, through hands that did not belong to the sender. Late afternoon, as the sun bent low and threw long shadows across the ranch, Sofia spotted a figure on horseback approaching the gate. She tensed, unsure, but Daniel stepped forward with the calm of a man who had been waiting for something like this. The rider was young, no more than 20, his face half hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He carried no rifle, only a folded envelope tucked into his vest, which he pulled free and extended without dismounting. Daniel took it without a word. The rider gave a nervous nod, turned his horse, and was gone in a trail of dust before Sofia could even ask who he was. She moved to her uncle's side, questions already on her lips, but Daniel's expression silenced her. He opened the envelope with steady fingers, unfolded the paper inside, and read in silence. The words were brief, written in bold hand that wasted no effort on subtlety. The ranch was to be surrendered. The land, the roads, the buildings, all of it will belong to Vega's people. Refusal meant fire, blood, and ruin. A time was given, 1 week. It was not a negotiation. It was a decree. Sofia's eyes darted over the page, her breath catching. "They can't just," she began, but Daniel folded the note neatly and slid it back into the envelope. His calm unsettled her more than the threat itself. He set the paper on the porch rail and looked out across the land, his gaze moving over the fences, the barn, the corral. To her, it was the place she had come to love, a sanctuary of quiet and work. To him, it was ground to be defended, ground already chosen for the fight. He did not curse, did not rant. He poured himself a cup of water, drank, and set it down. "It was always coming," he said simply, as though he had been waiting for the words to catch up with what he already knew. Sofia clenched her fists, anger rising where his stillness only deepened. "You're not just going to let them." "I'm not letting anyone do anything," Daniel interrupted softly, his tone firm but without heat. He lifted the envelope once more, studied the neat fold of the paper, then tucked it into the breast pocket of his shirt. "This is noise. They think words make fear. Fear makes surrender." He glanced at her then, his eyes steady. "But fear doesn't live here." The rest of the evening passed in silence. Sofia moved about the kitchen, too restless to sit, while Daniel repaired a broken latch on the barn door with the same deliberate pace as always. His hands never hurried, his posture never changed. To an outsider, it would have looked like nothing had shifted, as if the note had been about a missed payment or a late delivery. But Sofia knew better. She saw in the way he lingered a little longer near the windows, and how his eyes swept the ridgelines more often than usual. When darkness fell, Daniel set the lantern low and sat at the table, the folded message resting beside him. He traced the edge of the envelope with his finger, not out of worry but in thought, cataloging possibilities. He had faced ultimatums before, in places where the stakes had been higher and the threats more immediate. He knew the truth about men like Esteban Vega. They mistook silence for weakness, patience for fear. They believed a rancher living alone on tired land would bend easily, because that was the story they told themselves. Sofia finally sat across from him, her voice low, uncertain. "What are we going to do?" Daniel looked at her for a long time before answering. "We keep working. We keep living. And when they come, we'll answer." She wanted to press him, to demand details, but the calm in his voice carried a finality that left no room for questions. She realized then that her uncle was not shaken because the ultimatum had not changed his path. It had only confirmed it. The week ahead would not be about deciding what to do. It would be about preparing for what was already inevitable. The week that followed the ultimatum carried with it an uneasy stillness, the kind that pressed down on the land and made even the wind hesitate. Daniel rose each morning before the sun, moving with a purpose that was steady but unspoken. He did not announce his intentions, and he did not explain his plans to Sofia. He simply worked, each task fitting into a larger design only he could see. He began with the house. The doors, worn from years of use, were reinforced with heavy beams cut to fit across the frames. He tested each one in silence, pushing against the wood until it no longer yielded to pressure. Windows were barred with metal rods taken from the barn, cut and fastened with bolts he had saved over the years. To Sofia, it looked like the house was being caged in, transformed from a home into a fortress. To Daniel, it was simply the first layer of defense, a shell meant to hold long enough for the rest of his work to matter. The yard came next. He dug shallow trenches near the fence lines, carefully positioned them where the ground dipped naturally, places where headlights might sweep past without catching the disturbance. He lined them with broken glass, shards hidden beneath a thin layer of sand, placed not to kill but to stall. Tires would shred, feet would bleed, confusion would spread. He knew that hesitation was as valuable as any weapon. In the barn, ordinary tools took on new forms. Shovels were sharpened to a fine edge, rakes adjusted, so their tines could be used as spikes. He fashioned lengths of wire into tripwires, stringing them low across entrances where a man rushing forward might not see until it was too late. Old fuel cans were filled halfway and placed where a single spark could turn them into fire traps. The work was methodical, precise, and never rushed. Each step was a reminder of habits learned long ago, habits that had never truly left him. Sofia watched, first with confusion, then with a growing sense of awe. She offered her help where she could, carrying wood, holding beams steady, fetching nails from the workbench. She didn't ask why her uncle chose certain places for his traps, or why he studied the land so carefully before placing each defense. She began to understand that questions would not help, that his silence was not meant to shut her out, but to focus his mind on what mattered most. At night, Daniel walked the perimeter with her close behind, pointing out ridges and arroyos, showing her where to step and where to avoid. "Shadows hide more than men," he told her once, voice low against the desert wind. "They hide mistakes, too. Don't make them." She nodded, memorizing the routes, realizing that every instruction was not just for practice, but for survival. By the end of the week, the ranch no longer looked like a quiet homestead. To an outsider, perhaps, it still carried the same weathered boards and sagging roof, but beneath that surface it had become something else entirely. Every fence line was a boundary prepared for interruption, every path a channel designed to trap or mislead. The land itself had been reshaped into an ally. On the final evening, Daniel sat on the porch, sharpening his knife in the dim light of a lantern. Sofia sat nearby, the quiet wave of exhaustion settling on her shoulders. She glanced around the property, taking in the changes, and felt the shift in her chest. This was no longer the peaceful ranch she had come to for rest. It was a place waiting for a storm. Daniel looked out into the horizon, his movements unhurried, his expression unchanged. To him, there was no panic in preparation, no fear in the labor. There was only work, done carefully, done right, because he knew the truth the desert had been whispering for weeks. The silence before violence is not peace. It is warning. And when the warning ends, only readiness remains. The desert night had a way of stirring old memories. And as Daniel walked the perimeter with the stars cold above him, the silence folded back into years he thought he had buried. The crunch of gravel under his boots became the crunch of shale on a mountainside half a world away. The smell of dry earth gave way to dust thick with cordite and sweat. Afghanistan returned not as images he invited, but as moments pressed so deep into him that the land itself could summon them. He remembered the outposts where the walls were nothing more than sandbags stacked against a hillside, where nights stretched into weeks without real sleep. He had been younger then, leaner, but already carved by the discipline that came with carrying men's lives on his shoulders. The enemy never announced themselves. They slipped through ravines hid among shepherds and waited for darkness to give them cover. It was a game of patience, one Daniel had learned to master. He could sit still for hours, his rifle steady, his breath shallow, until the faintest movement revealed what others would miss. That patience became habit, and habit became survival. There had been a mission in the Karengal Valley, the kind no one spoke about after it ended. His team had moved under cover of moonlight, climbing ridges so steep their knees bled through their uniforms. The objective was simple on paper: intercept a weapons cache before it reached the valley floor. In truth, it had been anything but simple. The mountains hid more than stone. They had eyes, and those eyes had followed them from the moment they set out. He could still see the flash when the first shot cracked the silence. The point man fell, and the world erupted in chaos. Daniel's voice cut through it, steady, commanding, even as rounds chewed into the rocks around them. He moved without hesitation, dragging his comrade to cover, firing in bursts that were measured, controlled. The men who fought beside him had looked to him in that moment, not because he was the loudest, but because he was the calmest. Fear had no place in his tone, and it steadied them when the valley itself seemed ready to swallow them whole. By dawn, the cache was destroyed, the mission marked as complete in some report that never captured the cost. 3 men did not return, and their absence settled into Daniel like stones he would carry forever. He learned then that ruthlessness was not cruelty. It was necessity. Hesitation had no mercy, and so he had stripped it from himself. Every movement after that, every decision, was sharpened by the memory of men who had trusted him to act without doubt. The lantern on the porch flickered, pulling him back to the present. Yet the echoes of that valley lingered in the corners of his mind. He looked across the ranch, the trenches dug, the traps hidden, the tools sharpened into weapons, and he recognized the same patterns. Different land, different enemy, but the same truths. Patience, preparation, precision. Sofia's light still glowed faintly in her window, and he thought of the young soldiers who had once looked to him for direction. He had led them because silence steadied them, because stillness gave them courage. Now, whether she realized it or not, his niece looked to him the same way. He would not let her see the ghosts that haunted him, but he would let her see the strength they had forged. The past did not release men like him. It lived beneath the skin, in the scars, and the discipline that shaped every choice. Daniel Reyes was no longer in Afghanistan, but as he sat sharpening his knife, listening for footsteps in the dust, he understood that the war had never truly ended. It had only changed shape, waiting for him to meet it again. The desert had been quiet all evening, the kind of stillness that presses against the skin and makes every small sound feel louder than it should. Sofia sat near the window, a book open on her lap, though she had not turned a page in an hour. She sensed something in the way her uncle moved about the house, the way he paused near the windows, the way his silence felt heavier than usual. Daniel did not speak of it, but his presence carried a weight she could not ignore. Then the first vibration reached them, a low hum that traveled to the floorboards before it reached their ears. Sofia frowned, glancing toward the window, and Daniel had already crossed the room to douse the lantern. Darkness filled the house, broken only by the faint wash of moonlight through the glass. The hum grew louder, engines grinding against the silence of the desert night. Sofia pressed her back against the wall, holding her breath. Out on the horizon, Faint specks of light appeared, weaving together into a moving line. One became 2, then 5, then more. Headlights cut through the dark, sweeping across the plains as a convoy of trucks rolled forward. The sound of engines was no longer distant. It was a living, growing roar, and with it came the pulse of music blasting from one of the lead vehicles. A heavy rhythm thudded across the open ground, carried by men who wanted to be heard, who wanted their approach to be a message as much as a threat. Daniel stood still, his profile sharp in the moonlight, eyes fixed on the incoming line. His hand rested on the rifle leaning by the door, not in haste, but in readiness. He had known this would come. The ultimatum had not been idle words. It had been a countdown, and the time had run out. Sofia's chest tightened. Her throat felt dry, and she forced herself to steady her breathing. She remembered the way Daniel had corrected her grip on the rifle days earlier, how he had shown her to breathe before she squeezed. She thought of those lessons now, clutching the pistol he had given her with both hands, the weight of it more real than it had ever been before. She was afraid, but she was not unprepared. The trucks fanned out as they neared the boundary of the ranch, engines revving, headlights cutting arcs of light across the land, dust plume behind them, glowing in the beams like smoke. Shouts carried faintly over the noise, voices in Spanish raised in crude laughter, mocking, confident. They believed the ranch was theirs for the taking, that the threat of fire and destruction would scatter an old man and his niece. Inside the house, Daniel gave a slow nod, as if confirming something only he understood. He turned to Sofia, his voice low, measured. "Remember what I told you. Stay low. Don't waste a shot." She nodded, her knuckles white against the pistol's grip. Her fear had not vanished, but it was tempered now by his calm. If he could face this without flinching, then so could she. The music outside grew louder, the bass line pounding against the walls as the first trucks drew close to the fence. The convoy slowed, engines idling with the menace of a predator circling its prey. Headlights swept over corrals, the barn, the house itself, flooding the land with harsh light that turned shadows into jagged shapes. Sofia pressed herself against the floor near the window, her heart racing, her breath controlled. She could hear the cattle shifting nervously, hooves striking against the ground in agitation. She could hear men shouting orders, laughter turning to sharp commands. Daniel moved to the door, his body a silhouette of stillness, a soldier waiting for the exact moment to strike. The raid had begun, but he treated it not as chaos, not as panic, but as the opening move of a game he had played many times before. The desert, the ranch, the night itself, all of it had been shaped for this moment. He had laid the ground, set the traps, prepared the defenses. The enemy thought they were advancing into weakness. In truth, they were stepping into his design. The music, the lights, the noise, none of it unsettled him. It only told him what he already knew. Arrogance makes men careless. He glanced once at Sofia, a brief look that told her without words that she was ready, that she was part of this now. And then, as the trucks rolled closer, the land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first strike. The headlights swept wider across the open ground, beams catching the dust and throwing it into harsh, glowing clouds. The trucks slowed as they reached the first fence line, engines snarling as if daring the night to resist them. Men shouted over the roar, their voices confident, certain of what was about to happen. The ranch looked quiet, a lonely structure with sagging boards and no sign of defense. To them it was nothing, an old man's burden waiting to be taken. Then the first truck rolled over the tripwire. The explosion was not large enough to tear apart the desert, but it was precise. A buried canister ignited beneath the front axle, flipping the vehicle sideways with a violent lurch. Metal screamed as the truck landed on its side, headlights cutting into the dirt before shattering. Shouts erupted, confused and panicked, the convoy halting in a stuttering line. Men scrambled from the overturned truck, stumbling, blinded by dust and the sudden collapse of their certainty. Before they could regain order, another truck pushed forward, its driver shouting curses as he gunned the engine. 50 yards ahead, another wire snapped beneath the tires. This time, a fireball bloomed upward, tearing through the night with a flash that lit the ranch like daylight. The truck lifted briefly off the ground, slammed back down, and erupted in smoke. The sound thundered across the plains, echoing through barns and corrals. Sofia flinched at the window, her pistol tight in her hands. But Daniel did not move from his position by the door. His face was calm, eyes fixed on the chaos outside. Each explosion had been measured, placed not to wipe out the convoy entirely, but to scatter them, to disrupt their rhythm. Panic was a sharper weapon than fire, and it was already cutting through their ranks. Men spilled from the remaining trucks, firing blindly into the dark, their rifles flashing with erratic bursts. The rounds struck fences, kicked up dirt, punched holes in the side of the barn, but none of them found the house. Their aim was sloppy, driven by fear rather than precision. The desert amplified their confusion. Every shadow turning into a threat, every rustle in the grass mistaken for movement. Daniel moved to the window, peering through a narrow crack he had left unsealed. He counted their positions, noted how they clustered near the remaining trucks, too afraid to move forward. They shouted to one another, voices rising with the strain of men who no longer trusted the ground beneath their feet. He allowed himself a small nod. The first line had done exactly as intended. Outside, the cattle bellowed, their cries mingling with the sound of gunfire and shouting men. Dust churned into a choking haze as boots pounded across the sand. The attackers had expected an easy claim, a frightened surrender. Instead, they had walked into an invisible perimeter, one that punished arrogance with sudden fire. Daniel returned to his chair by the door, resting the rifle across his knees. His calmness steadied Sofia, though her heart pounded so hard she thought it might betray her. She whispered, "They're coming closer." He looked at her, his eyes as steady as his voice. They won't reach this house without paying for every step. The attackers regrouped, gathering near the edge of the fence line. Their leaders barked orders, pushing them forward, trying to reassert control. But hesitation clung to their movements. They advanced slower now, scanning the ground nervously, afraid of what might wait with each stride. The explosions had done more than destroy trucks. They had broken the illusion of certainty. Daniel watched the horizon, his hand steady on the rifle, his mind already shifting to the next layer of defense. The first strike had been theirs. The next, he knew, would have to be his. The night was only beginning, and the land itself had already chosen sides. The gunfire faded into scattered bursts as the dust settled, the attackers spreading out across the property. They moved cautiously now, rifles raised, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The explosions had stripped away their swagger, but not their orders. They still pressed forward, inching past the ruined trucks, skirting the trenches that smoldered with smoke. From the porch, Daniel watched their hesitation with the same calm he had carried since the night began. He knew fear slowed men, but fear also made them dangerous. He rose without a word and slipped into the barn. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hay and old wood, the beams creaking softly above him. He moved between the stalls, silent, his steps measured, the rifle cradled low. Every corner, every gap in the boards, he knew by heart. This was his ground, and he was no longer a rancher walking it. He was a soldier navigating familiar terrain. A shadow stretched across the far wall, the outline of man creeping along the outer side of the barn. Daniel pressed himself flat, waiting, the years folding back until he was once more in a foreign village, listening for the shift of boots outside a mud wall. The man stepped through the side entrance, rifle leading the way, his breath quick and shallow. He had no chance to see the figure that lunged from the dark, striking with ruthless efficiency. Daniel's knife slid across his throat, and the body crumpled into the hay with barely a sound. Daniel dragged him deeper into the shadows and moved on. He reached the back of the barn, slipped out into the corrals, and stayed low against the fence. Another intruder moved between the pens, his flashlight cutting erratic beams across the ground as he searched. Daniel followed the light, not the man, waiting until it jerked away, leaving the attacker blind for a heartbeat. In that heartbeat, Daniel was already on him, rifle stock slamming into the back of his skull. The man collapsed without a cry, the light rolling uselessly across the dirt until Daniel crushed it beneath his boot. The corrals filled with tension. Horses shifted nervously, their snorts loud in the night, hooves striking against wooden boards. The animals sensed what the men did not, that the predator among them was not the one they had come to kill. Daniel slipped from pen to pen, his silhouette vanishing into shadows. He moved with the rhythm of someone who had spent years mastering patience, someone who knew exactly when to strike. Two more advanced together, whispering in Spanish, their rifles sweeping the darkness. Daniel crouched low, listening. He picked his moment as they passed the broken gate, their backs briefly exposed. The wire trap snapped under their boots, jerking one to the ground with a scream. The other spun, panicked, only to meet Daniel head-on. A swift strike disarmed him, a second broke his balance, and he went down hard. The wire-bound man struggled, but Daniel's blade ended the fight in silence. Gunfire erupted again close to the house as others fired at phantom movements, wasting ammunition on shadows. Daniel ignored it. Their panic worked in his favor. Each shot revealed their positions. Each mistake drew them deeper into the maze he had laid across the ranch. He was not defending a house. He was dismantling an assault one man at a time, turning barns and corrals into a battlefield they could not read. By the time he circled back toward the barn, the ground was littered with the still bodies of men who had thought the night belonged to them. Their rifles lay abandoned. Their shouts had dwindled into tense silence. Daniel paused, listening again to the desert. Coyotes cried in the distance, but nearer to the ranch, nothing moved. The attackers were learning what others before them had learned in faraway valleys and mountains, that he did not fight loudly, and he did not fight carelessly. He fought like a shadow, and once the shadow marked you, there was no escape. Sofia watched from the window of the house, her eyes wide as she caught glimpses of her uncle moving through the chaos. To her, it was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The man who mended fences and taught her to read the land was gone. In his place was something forged long ago in fire and silence, a figure who knew every step, every strike, every breath. The barn and corrals had become his battlefield, and he owned every inch of it. Daniel moved back toward the house, blending once more into the shadows. His rifle was steady, his face unreadable. Close quarters had cost the enemy dearly, but he knew this was only the middle of the storm. More would come, and he would be ready. The night was not yet finished. It had only begun to bend. The loft smelled of dust and hay, a thick, dry scent that clung to everything and made the air feel heavier. Sofia's heart hammered against her ribcage as she crouched behind a stack of bales, pistol pressed tightly in her hands. The noise outside the barn had grown closer, heavy footsteps and shouted commands echoing through the wooden beams. She could hear the scrape of boots on the floor below, the nervous whisper of men unsure where the shadows had moved. Her fingers shook despite the lessons Daniel had drilled into her, and she realized in that moment that no amount of practice could fully prepare her for the raw, immediate terror of it. She aimed toward the trapdoor opening at the edge of the loft, her eyes narrowing as one figure came into view. He did not see her immediately, blinded by the chaos and the dust from the trucks overturned outside. Her mind raced, the instructions Daniel had given her echoing. Breathe, aim, steady, wait for the right moment. The man shifted, leaning slightly to inspect the floor below, and Sofia exhaled slowly, the sound barely leaving her lips. She squeezed the trigger. The shot rang loud, more than she expected, and the figure jerked backward, clutching his shoulder. He stumbled, giving a startled shout that carried through the barn. Her heart raced even faster, but a sliver of pride cut through the fear. She had done it. She had defended herself. Another shadow moved along the edge of the loft. She pivoted, pistol raised, unsure she could act again with the same precision. The sound of rushing footsteps behind her made her spin, and for a brief instant, panic clawed at her chest. Then Daniel was there, silent and precise as always, appearing at the trapdoor just as another intruder stepped into view. His presence was a shock, both terrifying and reassuring. One movement of his hand signaled her to stay low while he handled the new threat, his rifle snapping up with the smooth, practiced precision of a man who had spent decades mastering combat. Sofia's hands were steadier now, the adrenaline sharpened by necessity. She watched as her uncle dispatched the man with efficiency, a single controlled shot that ended the threat before it had time to react. He moved like a shadow, but she noticed something in his eyes, a flicker of pride, the kind he never offered in words, directed at her. She was alive, and she had acted. The law felt smaller, the shadows pressing in closer as the sounds of the remaining attackers below grew chaotic. Sofia realized the lesson Daniel had been teaching her went far beyond marksmanship. It was discipline, patience, and control. Each breath mattered. Each decision carried weight, and hesitation could be fatal. The fear that had nearly paralyzed her had been replaced by focus, a sharpened awareness that allowed her to act with intent. Daniel moved to the loft beside her, checking corners and sweeping beams with his rifle as they descended toward the barn floor. He didn't speak, but his steady presence was enough. Sofia felt a surge of determination. This was no longer practice, no longer training. This was survival, and she was no longer a bystander. Together, they moved toward the nearest exit, Daniel covering her while she kept her pistol ready. Each step, each glance, each careful breath reinforced what she had learned. She could act, she could defend, and in the worst of moments, she could rely on the instincts her uncle had awakened in her. The barn no longer felt like a trap. It was a proving ground, and she had passed the first test. When at last they reached the safety of the porch, Sofia's hand still trembled, but her chest swelled with a quiet confidence. Daniel lowered his rifle, eyes scanning the distance, and gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. She had survived. She had acted. And in that moment, she understood that her uncle's lessons had prepared her not just to aim, but to endure. The horizon burned orange with the first hint of sunrise, the kind of light that should have promised calm but instead carried a tension thick enough to choke the desert air. Daniel had been moving quietly through perimeter, checking tripwires and reinforcing gates, when a distant rumble reached his ears. It was not the usual sound of shifting tires or a lone engine testing the land. It was heavier, deliberate, the echo of power and arrogance rolling across the plains. Esteban Vega appeared first as a silhouette against the morning glow, stepping from a convoy of black trucks with an entourage that radiated menace. He moved with the arrogance of a man who expected obedience, flanked by armed men whose rifles caught the rising sun in flashes of steel. His shirt, crisp and tailored, contrasted sharply with the dirt and sweat of the ranch, a visual testament to the authority he carried and the wealth that backed it. The riders behind him slowed as they approached the gates, but Esteban advanced alone, stepping from the truck as if he were the storm incarnate. Daniel observed him from the shadow of the barn, rifle resting across his shoulders, body relaxed but ready. He had faced threats before, but the presence of the cartel leader was different. Esteban was not a foot soldier or a scout. He was the mind behind the plan, the man who believed fear was a tool and that authority could bend even the unyielding. He expected submission, and he would settle for nothing less. Esteban's eyes swept across the ranch, taking the fences, the barn, the house, as if assessing property to be claimed rather than a man to be opposed. "Daniel Reyes," he called, his voice carrying across the acres, sharp and deliberate, designed to cut through the quiet. "I've come to collect what is mine. Your land, your cattle, your pride. You will not resist. You will not slow me." The words were venomous, each syllable a threat that promised consequences far beyond the loss of property. From the porch, Sofia pressed herself against the wall, rifle clutched to her chest, heart pounding. She had learned much under her uncle's guidance, but the sheer presence of Esteban Vega, the man whose name had carried weight across the border, made her blood run cold. Daniel stepped from the barn's shadow, calm and deliberate, letting his gaze meet Esteban's without flinching. There was no acknowledgement of fear in his stance, no hesitation, only the quiet readiness of someone who had anticipated this moment for weeks. The cartel leader's smile twisted into a snarl, frustration flickering as he realized that Daniel did not react with panic or negotiation. "I will make an example of you," Esteban spat, taking a few steps closer, the boots of his men echoing on the earth like a drumbeat of menace. "Everyone will know what happens to those who defy me. You will bleed before you see the sun rise again." Daniel's response was a slight nod, almost imperceptible, his hand resting on the rifle. His eyes measured every movement, every footstep, the distance to the nearest obstacle. He did not shout, did not curse. Words were unnecessary. Every trap set, every defensive line reinforced, Every detail of the ranch had been prepared for this confrontation. He had waited for the arrogance of men like Esteban Vega, and now it stood before him, ripe with assumption and overconfidence. The sun rose fully, illuminating the standoff. Dust swirled in the wake of the convoy's halt, the heat of the morning pressing against everyone present. Esteban's entourage fanned out, rifles raised, but the leader's focus never wavered from Daniel. He expected submission, and he expected it quickly. Yet Daniel remained unmoved, a figure of patience and calculated threat. For a long moment, the two men measured each other across the expanse of desert, one armed with authority and the expectation compliance, the other armed with preparation, precision, and decades of experience honed in places where mistakes meant death. Esteban's fury radiated outward, but Daniel's calm was absolute, unshakable, and it made the air between them heavier than any weapon. The first move had not yet been made, but the stage was set, and both men understood that the coming conflict would not be decided by words, but by action. Sofia swallowed hard, watching her uncle, realizing for the first time in full clarity the depth of his skill, the patience of a man who had walked through storms and emerged unbroken. Daniel Reyes was ready, and Esteban Vega had arrived at a ranch where arrogance alone would not carry him through. The desert stretched between them, the rising sun casting long, distorted shadows that painted the land in sharp contrasts of light and dark. Dust swirled in the convoy's wake, clinging to tires, boots, and the hems of Esteban's pants. But he did not seem to notice. He stepped forward, chest thrust out, eyes scanning the barn, the fences, and the house, as if it were all props in a theater built for his amusement. Around him, the cartel soldiers fanned out, rifles raised, but their confidence wavered under the weight of the silence coming from the ranch itself. Esteban stopped a few dozen yards from Daniel, a smug smile twisting his sharp features. He gestured toward the house, toward the fences, toward the man who had not moved a muscle. "You really think a tired old man like you can stand against me?" His voice carried across the sand, sharp and mocking, designed to provoke, to humiliate. "Viejo," he spat the word like it was venom, emphasizing every syllable. "Do you hear them, boys? This is the man who will stop us. Look at him, shaking hands, slow steps. Your land, your pride, your life, none of it matters. None of it will survive today." The soldiers laughed uneasily, though the humor lacked conviction. They were trained, armed, and dangerous, yet the calm stillness of man across the distance unnerved them. Their eyes flicked from Esteban to Daniel and back again, searching for some sign that the old man would flinch, that the fear they expected would ripple across his face. But there was nothing. Daniel did not respond with words. He did not raise a hand or even shift his stance. His face was unreadable, expression smooth, controlled, and the kind of silence that carried far more weight than any shouted threat. The desert wind shifted, brushing against him, and he let it wash over his shoulders, letting the heat of the sun warm him as if nothing were out of place. His eyes never left Esteban, steady, calculating, calm, and every second he did not speak or react drove the arrogance of the cartel soldiers deeper into unease. Esteban's tone grew sharper, more desperate, as if his insults alone could provoke a response. "You should know your place, old man," he said, taking a step closer, gesturing to the surrounding men with authority. "This is not your fight. You will end it before it begins, or you will regret every moment you thought you could resist me. I've crushed men younger, faster, smarter than you, and you will be no different. Everyone here knows it, even if you can't admit it yourself." Still, Daniel remained silent. He let the words wash over him without acknowledgement, without flicker of emotion. He did not shift his weight unnecessarily, did not blink in reaction to the mockery. The soldiers, trained killers, hardened by years of violence, began to glance at one another, uncertainty creeping into their movements. Their rifles, once steady, now twitched slightly in response to the tension, their confidence eroding beneath the weight of a quiet man who refused to play the role they expected. Sofia pressed herself against the corner of the house, heart pounding in her chest, hands clenched around the rifle. She understood instinctively that Daniel's calm was a weapon no one had accounted for. Words could wound, they could provoke, they could terrify, but silence, absolute and unyielding, could unsettle far more. Esteban growled under his breath, frustration rising as he tried to force a reaction. A crack, Anything confirmed the weakness he expected. The desert stretched between them, tense, unyielding. Each man measured the other, the soldiers awaiting action, their leader grasping for control, while Daniel Reyes stood unmoving, a mountain carved of patience, experience, and the unspoken knowledge that arrogance often precedes a fall. Time seemed to stretch. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of dust and sage, and the calm between them became a tangible force. Esteban barked another order, sharper this time, but it rang hollow, more a noise than a command. Daniel's stillness, his refusal to react, communicated far more than any words could have. Every soldier in that line knew, deep down, that they had miscalculated. This was not a man to intimidate. This was a man who had lived through storms far worse, and silence, measured in absolute, was his first strike. The desert sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the ranch and flattening the features of the land into broad, deceptive plains. Daniel stood on the ridge just beyond the northern fence line, surveying the ground with the patient precision that had carried him through decades of conflict. The convoy had slowed, men hesitant after the explosions and the first wave of chaos. Dust still rose from the overturned trucks, curling around the corrals and fading into the horizon. Daniel's eyes traced every contour of the property, every dip in the sand, every wash in a arroyo that could shape movement, block sight, or funnel men into predictable channels. He stepped quietly along a narrow path that ran parallel to the ridge, careful not to disturb the loose rocks. From this vantage point, he could see the cartel soldiers spreading across the plains, trying to reorganize. Some crouched behind trucks, scanning for movement, rifles raised but hands tight and anxious. Others attempted to regroup near the barn, their formation broken, morale already slipping. The first strike had sown fear, and fear made men predictable. Daniel moved with deliberate purpose, his steps barely whispering against the dust. He had memorized the land over weeks, tracing paths and marking obstacles in his mind as if they were coordinates on a map. The natural canyons behind the ranch formed narrow corridors, twists in the terrain that could trap even the most agile intruders. He began signaling subtly through a series of cues and whistles that he had practiced with Sofia earlier, though she remained safely within the house. His goal was not to engage them all at once, but to shape their movement, to divide them, to turn the environment itself into an ally. The first wave of soldiers, still uncertain after the explosions, began to fall into the natural funnel Daniel had predicted. They moved toward what seemed an open path, but were actually being guided by subtle obstructions he had set. Stakes hidden in brush, faintly marked ground that would slow their pace, the illusion of open desert masking the canyon mouth. One soldier tripped over a camouflage line, giving his comrades pause and creating hesitation that spread like a ripple through the group. Daniel's hand rested lightly on the rifle, not because he had to fire immediately, but because every movement mattered. He watched the men, calculated their reactions, and adjusted terrain in his mind accordingly. The canyon loomed ahead, a narrow, jagged cut through the earth, its walls high and unforgiving. As the soldiers entered it, their numbers compressed, their mobility restricted, and the precision of their leader, Esteban, became less effective. Orders shouted to the dust echoed back with confusion, delays compounding in real time. From the ridge, Daniel could see Esteban gesturing, pointing, trying to redirect his men, but the canyon had already claimed them. The narrow space forced them to bunch together, rifles overlapping, movement slowed, their confidence eroded by the sudden awareness that they were no longer in control. A sense of isolation settled over them. The men they had relied on for coordination, now trapped with walls that cut off sight and escape routes alike. Daniel descended the ridge slowly, his presence hidden by the brush, the terrain, the calculated chaos he had created. Each step placed him closer to the canyon, closer to where he could exploit the men's confusion without exposing himself unnecessarily. He did not rush. He never did. Time was a tool, and in the distorted rhythm of panic and dust, it worked for him, not against him. From the house, Sofia watched the movement below, understanding in fragments what her uncle had orchestrated. The canyon had become a cage of his own making, and every soldier funneled into it was at his mercy. Esteban's voice carried over the wind, sharp and commanding, but it was drowned by hesitation, the same hesitation Daniel had predicted. The turning point had arrived, not with gunfire or explosions, but with control over the land itself, a subtle mastery of terrain that made the enemy fall into a trap of their own arrogance. Daniel crouched behind a rock, surveying the canyon as the men bunched tighter, their formation fragmented, leadership impaired. His eyes were calm, his body still, yet every muscle held the readiness of a man who had carved victory out of far more perilous circumstances. The ranch was no longer a simple property. It had become a battlefield molded to his design. And in the canyon below, the cartel soldiers were learning, far too late, that their mistakes had been written into the earth itself. The morning heat pressed down, heavy and relentless, but it could not compete with the tension that gripped the ranch. Daniel stood near the porch, rifle in hand, eyes scanning every angle of property, muscles coiled in a readiness born of decades in war zones and deserts far harsher than this one. Dust rose in the distance, kicked up by the scattered convoy that had been funneled into the canyon behind the ranch, their confusion still raw. But now their panic had given way to determination. They would not retreat. Their leader, Esteban, demanded victory. Sofia crouched beside her uncle, pistol gripped tight, knuckles white, heart hammering against her chest. She had never experienced anything like this. Not in drills, not in lessons, not in her own imagination. The barn's shadow offered some cover, but it was thin. She had watched her uncle in action before, seen him move like a shadow, precise and unstoppable, but now the chaos surrounded them on every side. Dust swirled. Flames from small incendiary traps licked the ground where trucks had overturned, and the distant crack of rifle fire echoed off the corrals and the fence lines. The first wave of attackers burst from cover, rushing the house with shouts and the glint of rifles in the morning sun. Daniel fired a controlled burst from the porch, each shot deliberate, taking down the closest threat before they could close the distance. Sofia's first instinct was to fire blindly into the chaos, but Daniel's earlier lessons held her hand steady. She aimed, waited, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil jolting through her arms, a man fell to ground, stunned and unbalanced. She blinked, heart racing, and refocused. The attackers regrouped behind a low wall of debris, hurling stones and makeshift explosives toward the house. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and the acrid scent of gunpowder. Each flash of fire illuminated the barn, the corrals, the fences, and the silhouettes of men who believed they could take the ranch. Daniel moved with methodical precision, pivoting between the porch, the doors, and the shadows of the barn, picking targets with calm efficiency. Sofia mirrored him as best she could, ducking, taking aim, firing only when she could see clearly. The chaos was relentless. A second group approached from the western edge, trying to flank the house, but Daniel anticipated the movement. He had prepared channels and traps days before, and now those preparations worked against the attackers. A tripwire ignited a small charge, sending one man sprawling into a shallow trench, his rifle spinning away into the dust. Others froze, uncertain, exposed, as Daniel's shots cut them down systematically. Sofia's breathing came in sharp bursts, her ears ringing with the sound of gunfire and shouts. She had never felt this alive, this aware of every heartbeat, every movement, every shadow. She adjusted her aim again, lining up another target as the man's form staggered through the dust. Her shot rang true, and she dropped to the floor beside the porch, heart hammering but exhilarated. Daniel did not pause. His eyes scanned the horizon, noting the patterns of attack, predicting the next movement before it occurred. The men had underestimated the ranch, underestimated him, and underestimated the resolve of those standing beside him. He moved with Sofia in mind, covering her angles, clearing threats before they could reach her. Every shot, every step was precise, every action was calculated. By mid-morning, the attackers were scattered, their momentum broken. The house had held. The ranch remained under Daniel's control, and the land itself seemed to exhale, dust settling like a veil over chaos. Sofia lowered her pistol slowly, chest heaving, finally understanding the weight and purpose of the training her uncle had given her. Daniel watched the horizon for any remaining movement, eyes sharp, body still poised. "Not done," he muttered, though his voice carried no panic. Sofia nodded, understanding fully. They had survived the first wave, but the battle had only proven what Daniel had known all along. Control over land, patience, and precision were stronger than numbers, stronger than noise. And as the dust cleared and the canyon echoed with the retreating shouts of the attackers, the ranch stood unbroken, defended by hands and hearts forged through years of preparation, experience, and unwavering resolve. The barn smelled of dust, hay, and smoke, the air thick from the explosions and gunfire that had ripped across the ranch for hours. Shafts of morning light filtered through cracks in the roof, cutting narrow beams across the floor, where spent shells glinted like tiny stars in the dirt. Daniel moved through the shadows, silent, alert, every step deliberate as he scanned the stalls for movement. Esteban Vega had slipped past the traps that had scattered his men, his arrogance carrying him straight to the barn, where he believed Daniel would be waiting, frightened, or worse, paralyzed. Esteban entered with a rush, his pistol drawn, eyes blazing with fury. He had expected an old man to flinch, to beg, to surrender. Instead, he found calm. Daniel stepped from the corner, rifle lowered but ready, muscles coiled. The veteran's gaze met Esteban's, unyielding, measuring, and for the first time the cartel leader hesitated. The desert heat, the smoke, the chaos outside, all of it faded beneath the weight of the standoff. "You think this place belongs to you?" Esteban spat, his voice carrying the venom of arrogance. "You think an old man alone can hold what is mine? I'll make sure your death is slow, and everyone who watches will learn what happens to those who resist me." His pistol was steady, but his knuckles were white around the grip, and the tension in his shoulders betrayed impatience. Daniel said nothing. He didn't need words. His fingers brushed against the combat knife at his belt, the cold steel resting comfortably in his palm. Decades of training, missions in deserts and mountains, and battles that had demanded absolute focus were embedded in his movements. Every instinct, every reflex, every calculation told him how to control this encounter. Esteban lunged first, pistol aimed for Daniel's chest, finger on the trigger. Daniel shifted, stepping aside with a speed that betrayed his age, the knife rising in a defensive arc. The blade clashed against the steel barrel, striking with enough force to redirect the pistol downward. Esteban cursed, pulling back, but the rage in his eyes only made him reckless. He swung at Daniel with the butt of the weapon, a wild, uncontrolled motion that Daniel met with the tip of his knife, guiding the attack harmlessly aside. The two circled, the air between them taut with danger. Daniel's movements were deliberate, controlled, conserving energy and waiting for precise moment. Esteban's strikes were driven by fury, each one faster than the last, but lacking subtlety. The contrast between them was stark, veteran discipline against untempered rage. Daniel anticipated each move, deflecting, sidestepping, countering in ways that exploited Esteban's overconfidence. A kick to the midsection sent the cartel leader stumbling back, only for him to recover quickly. Gun swinging in a desperate arc, Daniel closed the distance, knife poised, and forced Esteban to the ground. The pistol skidded across the floorboards, its barrel striking the edge of a stall, sending a spray of sparks from the metal. Esteban roared in frustration, attempted to rise, but Daniel's control was absolute. One measured sweep of his arm disarmed him, pressing the knife's edge to his opponent's chest without hesitation, without excess. "You've underestimated me," Daniel said quietly, voice calm, almost gentle, as he held Esteban pinned. The words carried the weight of experience, of countless battles fought and survived. Rage met silence, arrogance met precision, and for the first time, the cartel leader understood that brute force would not win this fight. Esteban's chest heaved, his eyes wide with the realization that he had been outmatched, not by numbers, not by luck, but by a man whose calm had been forged in fire and tempered in war. Daniel did not strike. He had already won. The barn was silent, save for the faint creak of beams and the distant shuffle of retreating footsteps outside. And in that silence, Daniel Reyes remained unshaken, the victor without raising his voice, the shadow that had outlasted the storm. The barn smelled of smoke, scorched wood, and the iron tang of spent gunpowder. Dust floated lazily in the shafts of early morning light that pierced the gaps in the roof, catching on particles that swirled like ghosts in the still air. Daniel moved with quiet, deliberate rhythm, rifle lower for now, knife resting lightly in his palm. Every step was measured, every breath controlled, the kind of precision only decades of experience could cultivate. He had cornered Esteban Vega, the man who had stormed across the border with arrogance and fire, and the time for words had passed. Esteban's chest rose and fell sharply, his face flushed with fury, sweat streaking the side of his forehead. He had misjudged Daniel from the start. Thinking an old man would bend beneath threats, that discipline could be overcome by volume and aggression. But Daniel had allowed the chaos to work for him, had channeled it into predictable patterns, exploiting the arrogance that had guided the cartel leader's every move. Esteban had learned nothing about the man across from him, and that would be his undoing. The first approach was Esteban's, a rush forward, pistol raised, finger tight on the trigger. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, guiding the weapon off-center with a precise jab of the knife, the steel scraping against the barrel. Sparks flew, briefly illuminating the furrowed brow of the man who believed he was in control. Esteban cursed, jerking back, his momentum carrying him just beyond the edge of Daniel's reach. There was no pause. Daniel advanced with deliberate calm, forcing Esteban to retreat across the barn floor, his boots scuffing against the dirt, his eyes wide with realization that sharpened too late. Every lunge, every swing, every desperate movement from the cartel leader was anticipated. Daniel's motions were minimal but exact. A twist here, a press there, the edge of his knife nudging Esteban off balance, redirecting force instead of meeting it head-on. Esteban's arrogance, his fury, was what betrayed him. In his blind rush to overpower the old man, he left openings, small slivers of space where Daniel's precision could find purchase. A kick to the knee, gentle but unrelenting, brought the leader down just enough to destabilize him. Daniel stepped close, blade in the right hand, rifle braced with the left, guiding Esteban into a corner of the barn where there was no room to maneuver, no escape. The silence was as important as the strike. No shouts, no warnings, just a controlled application of force. Daniel pressed a knife to the side of Esteban's chest, enough to subdue, not to kill, a calculated threat that communicated dominance without theatrics. The cartel leader's arms flailed briefly, then stilled, his arrogance replaced by a dawning comprehension. He had underestimated the quiet, patient discipline of a soldier who had survived far worse. Daniel did not speak. He did not gloat. The lesson was clear in every measured movement. Precision over power, patience over panic. Esteban's men, watching from outside, felt the tension ripple through the air, the faintest click of movement marking the defeat of their leader without a single raised voice. Sofia, pressed against the loft railing, swallowed hard, watching her uncle's calm finish the fight. She had fired before, but never with this mastery, never against someone who had underestimated her family so completely. The lesson he had imparted through weeks of preparation, through training and observation, was now manifest. Courage was not noise, and skill was not show. The barn settled into silence again, dust still hanging in the air. Esteban lay subdued, the fire of arrogance extinguished by the measured precision of a man who had never forgotten what it meant to survive, to fight, and to command the land itself as an extension of his will. Daniel stood over him, breathing steady, eyes clear. The fight was over, silent, efficient, absolute. The last strike had been delivered not in haste, not in fury, but in the unerring certainty of a soldier who had spent his life preparing for this very moment. The sun was climbing higher now, spilling light across the ranch in harsh, unrelenting beams, illuminating the wreckage left behind. Dust still hung in the air, settling slowly on scorched fences, dented vehicles, and the splintered boards of the barn. The ground was littered with discarded weapons, scattered ammunition, and footprints muddied by sweat and panic. Where once the cartel had advanced in confidence, only silence remained, broken by the occasional groan or shuffle of retreating men fleeing into the desert beyond the ridges. Sofia stepped cautiously from the porch, her pistol lowered but still in hand, eyes wide as she took in the scene. She could see the overturned trucks, some still smoldering, their tires shredded by hidden spikes, their engines silent. Bodies lay where they had fallen, the chaos frozen in the aftermath, and the scent of gunpowder and scorched earth hung heavy in the air. She glanced toward her uncle, who moved with deliberate calm across the yard, inspecting the fences, the gates, and the positions where the intruders had tried to force their way through. Daniel had not celebrated. There was no smile, no exclamation. His expression remained steady, practiced, as if he had done this 100 times before, though each confrontation was unique. He knelt to examine a tripwire snapped in the first wave, then checked the perimeter, ensuring that nothing had been overlooked. Each movement was precise, deliberate, and measured with the same discipline he had carried through every mission of his past. He understood that victory was fleeting. Preparation and vigilance were eternal. The sounds of engines rumbled faintly from the distant road, bringing with them the reality that reinforcements or authorities would soon arrive. Sofia followed Daniel's gaze toward the horizon and spotted a single patrol truck kicking up dust. Sheriff Morales had arrived, his vehicle slowing as he took in scene, boots crunching across the gravel as he approached. His hat was tilted back, sweat darkening the brim, and his eyes widened in disbelief as he scanned the ruined convoy and scattered men who had fled in panic, leaving their leader subdued and the ranch largely intact. Daniel met the sheriff at the edge of the porch. Calm as ever, Morales' voice broke the silence, a mixture of awe and incredulity. I don't know what to say, he admitted, gesturing toward the destroyed trucks and empty desert beyond. I thought they'd take this place, that... He shook his head, unable to complete the thought. I didn't think anyone could do what you've done. Daniel's reply was measured, quiet, and unassuming. They underestimated the land, he said simply, and they underestimated patience. That was their mistake. Sofia watched the exchange, heart still pounding, and finally allowed herself to lower her pistol fully. The ranch had been tested, scorched and scarred, but it had survived. She followed her uncle's steps as he moved to the barn, inspecting doors, checking locks, making sure that no overlooked threat remained. Even in the midst of victory, his vigilance never wavered. Morales wandered the property, eyes wide as he noted every detail. The scorched patches along the fence line, the improvised traps that had caused the chaos, the way the terrain had been used to divide and isolate the enemy. He shook his head again, muttering under his breath. I've seen a lot in my time, he said finally, turned to Daniel, but nothing like this. Not strategy, not execution, not a man alone holding an entire assault at bay. Daniel did not answer immediately, only swept his gaze across the horizon, noting the empty desert where the attackers had fled. The wind stirred dust into the air, carrying the scent of scorched earth and spent gunpowder. Victory had come, but it was quiet, disciplined, and absolute. The ranch stood as it always had, a testament to preparation, skill, and a man who had never forgotten what it meant to survive. Sofia moved beside him, eyes tracing the remnants of the assault, and finally spoke. We did it, she said softly. Daniel gave a slight nod, not celebratory, but acknowledging. The battle was over. The threat had been routed. And though the ranch bore scars of the fight, it remained standing, an unbroken fortress shaped by hands and minds that refused to yield. Sheriff Morales lingered for a moment longer, studying Daniel with a mix of respect and disbelief. The desert around them was silent, save for the faint rustle of wind through the mesquite, carrying the understanding that the land had survived, the invaders had fled, and a veteran's discipline had won where arrogance had failed. The sun had climbed higher, warm and steady, washing the ranch in a light that made every detail of the aftermath visible. Dust clung to the fences, to the scorched boards of the barn, and to the boots of Daniel and Sofia as they moved through the yard. The remnants of the assault were everywhere. Upturned trucks, discarded weapons, scorched earth, and footprints that marked the retreat of men who had underestimated the land and the man defending it. But the chaos of the morning had faded into a brittle calm, and in that stillness, Sofia felt the weight of what had changed, not just the ranch, but herself. She followed Daniel as he inspected the perimeter, rifle slung casually across his back, his movements deliberate and precise. Every step he took was measured, every glance assessing not just the terrain, but the lessons he had imparted to her. She had fired her first shot in defense, had moved through shadows and cover, and had learned the rhythm of discipline, patience, and control. The fear she had carried that morning had not vanished, but had transformed into something sharper, steadier, a recognition of what it meant to act under pressure, to make decisions that mattered. Sofia paused near the barn, tracing a finger along the edge of a splintered board where one of the intruders had forced the door. She remembered the panic in her chest, the deafening rush of adrenaline, and how her uncle had guided her silently, with unspoken authority. She had thought of him then not as a quiet man tending cattle, but as a force of nature honed by decades of preparation. The realization settled in her chest. She had changed because of this, because of him, and because of the night that had tested them both. Daniel stopped at the edge of the corral and looked toward her, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp. "You're steadier than you think," he said, the words quiet but carrying weight. Sofia's lips pressed together, a small nod her only response. She did not need praise. Not really. What she felt was enough. A certainty that she could act when necessary, that she could face fear without being consumed by it. They moved in tandem across the property, checking gates, inspecting the traps Daniel had set, and reinforcing what needed attention. Sofia carried tools and supplies, her body sore, her hands blistered, but her movements confident. Every step was deliberate. Every glance informed by the lessons her uncle had drilled into her over weeks of preparation. She had once seen the ranch as a retreat, a place of quiet escape, but now it was a classroom, a proving ground, and she was a student who had graduated through fire and chaos. The barn, where the final confrontation had taken place, loomed behind them like a silent witness. Sofia stopped at the loft, looking down at the floorboards, the dust, the evidence of her first real battle. She inhaled slowly, letting the smell of hay and gunpowder mingle in her senses, grounding her in the reality of what had happened. This was not a story she would ever forget. It was a lesson etched into her memory, inseparable from the presence of the man who had guided her through it. Daniel moved beside her, his hand brushing hers briefly, a silent acknowledgement that they had survived together. There were no words necessary. Survival had spoken for them. Sofia met his gaze, recognizing the quiet bond that had formed. Not just a family, but shared trials, of understanding forged in shadows and fire, in the weight of responsibility. The afternoon sun warmed her back as they walked toward the house, the ranch now quiet except for the soft lowing of cattle and the occasional rattle of a loose board. Sofia carried herself differently, shoulders squared, movements purposeful, eyes alert but calm. She was no longer naive. She had inherited the discipline, the awareness, the patience that had defined her uncle's life. And in that shared silence, as they moved together through the property they had defended, she understood that their bond was no longer simply a family, but a survival of respect and of a trust that could withstand any storm the desert or the world might bring. The first light of dawn crept across the desert, painting the horizon in pale streaks of gold and pink. Daniel moved along the northern fence line, hammer in hand, each strike measured and deliberate, echoing softly through the stillness. The events of the past days, the explosions of gunfire, the chaos that had threatened to consume the ranch, already felt like distant echoes here in the calm of morning. The dust had settled. The air smelled of dry earth and fresh timber, and the cattle grazed quietly, oblivious of the storm that had passed through their land. Sofia moved beside him, carrying a coil of wire over her shoulder, her steps steady and unhurried. She had changed, though Daniel did not need to tell her this. He could see it in the way she adjusted the posts, how she observed the land, how she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had survived and learned. The lessons of the last week had been harsh, brutal even, but they had left a mark far deeper than any physical scar. She was no longer a visitor to the ranch. She was a guardian in training, someone who understood instinctively the weight of vigilance and the discipline required to wield it. The fence had taken the brunt of the first intrusions, splinter boards that now needed to be replaced, wire that had been cut in careless testing. Daniel worked steadily, hammering posts into ground, tightening the wire with careful hands. To an outsider, it might have seemed like ordinary ranch work, mundane and repetitive, a man tending to his property as he always had. Yet each motion carried the echo of readiness, a quiet assurance that the land was defended, and that its owner had walked through far darker nights than this. He paused to rest, leaning against a post, eyes sweeping across the horizon. The desert seemed calm, but he knew better. The canyon beyond the ridges still held memory of the men who had fled, their retreat marking them as foolish for underestimating him. He could almost feel the heat of their regret, the imprint of their fear on the dust they had left behind. Esteban Vega's arrogance had been shattered, his pride humbled by the precision and patience of man who had never forgotten the lessons of combat, of patience, of preparation. Sofia adjusted a section of wire nearby, her movements deliberate, and glanced at her uncle. Daniel nodded once, the faintest acknowledgement, and she understood. No words were needed between them. Survival, discipline, and shared experience had spoken far louder than any conversation could. The bond forged in the chaos of battle remained unbroken, strengthened by fire and fear, and it would carry them to whatever might come next. By mid-morning, the fence was repaired, the corral gate secured, and the barn inspected once more. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, looking over the property as if testing its integrity, his mind cataloging every vantage point, every potential weakness, every measure of preparedness that would keep them safe in the future. To any traveler passing along the distant road, the ranch would appear unchanged, ordinary, unremarkable. A simple homestead in a vast desert. But the land itself bore the imprint of the storm that passed through. The trenches, the hidden tripwires, the cleared lines of sight. And the family who lived here now carried knowledge that outsiders could never understand. Daniel returned to the porch, eyes sweeping the ridges one last time before taking a seat in the quiet shade. The ranch endured, unchanged in outward appearance but fundamentally altered in truth. It had survived a threat that most would have assumed unstoppable, and its owner had proven that patience, precision, and discipline could make even the most arrogant foe falter. The desert wind stirred gently, carrying the faint scent of dry earth and grass, and Daniel breathed it in deeply. The quiet strength of his life, his land, and his family settling around him. Outwardly, the ranch seemed ordinary, but those who had tested it, those who had underestimated its master, would never forget the shadow of Daniel Reyes and the lesson the desert had delivered through him.